So today we're going to look at putting that clam toss quilt together. Now once again, this gets put together completely different than Glam Clam. Glam Clam we pieced a row at a time, left to right, top to bottom, and this goes together completely different. We sew this in diagonal wavy rows. So the pattern's laid out pretty carefully about how things go together. But it is a lot of reading. So there's a couple of points that I thought I would talk you through here that will hopefully make the process a little bit easier for you as you play. Okay, so one thing that I want you to do is pay close attention to the direction of your half clams and your clams when you are piecing your diagonal wavy rows together. So this is an example of a diagonal wavy row. So you see how that curve changes from convex to concave. It goes in both directions, in other words. And there's a half shape at the beginning and the end. So on your odd rows, all of your clams and half clams alternate between pointing up and to the right. And on your even rows, they all alternate in between pointing down and to the left. So that's a really quick tip. Just to keep things oriented as you're sewing them together. You're also sewing these really short sort of half curved shapes as well. So actually sewing the rows together is pretty easy, and I give you pretty clear directions in here as far as orienting the shapes on your machine. Remember that the red circles represent where your needle would be going on your sewing machine. So if you see a red circle, that's how you orient it, and that's where you position it under your needle. Okay, so the next thing is a couple of tips about sewing the rows together, because I think this is where it gets a little bit more complicated for this particular pattern. One of the things that's a little bit different is at the end of every row, it'll be a one end or the other. You'll have a half clam with a little tip on it. That tip is the one you want to fold back an approximate 1/4 inch and to press it. The reason being, the way the rows get sewn together, if you don't do that, you kind of have a raw edge on the top of your quilt. So you'll see on this row, I've already done that. I just folded that tip back. That's the end, the half clam on the end that has the tip on it. On the opposite side, the half clam, the tip is sewn already to your project, so you don't worry about it there. So it's only on this side that we worry about, the one that has the tip kind of hanging by itself. We simply fold that back and press it. And that'll make a little bit more sense when we sew the rows together. So, and the next thing that I'm going to tell you to do, which if you have been following me for any length of time, that you know I don't do often, or I don't do unless it's necessary. These are 8-inch clamshells. For 6 and 8, I definitely recommend it. But even for the 10 and 12-inch on this particular pattern, and that is to pin. So we're going to do a little bit of pinning just so we can sew those rows together. We want our seams to nestle nicely. We want to capture the tips of the clamshells really nicely. So pinning really helps us to get things lined up nicely. And the other thing is these, like I said before, the curves change from convex to concave throughout the whole length of the curve. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult to use our pinless piecing technique that we've been using. So now when we pin, we're just sewing between each section of the pin using that technique, and it works really well. So I've sewn the first 2 rows together because it's kind of a short seam, and I wanted to sew rows 2 and 3 together because it's a longer seam and it captures a couple of different other concepts that the first 2 did not. So the first thing that I always do, and I do this a lot in all of my patterns and projects, is I look at the project right side up first. So I look at both rows right side up, and there's a couple of things I'm checking. One is that the top and side edges are nice and straight. If this row were turned around, then the piece would come out like that, and it would not be a nice straight clean edge. So that's one check, that our row is oriented properly. And then the second thing is, before we flip it and start to pin, we just want it to be nicely lined up. So there's that. So the first thing that I do, I flip those rows right sides together, and first thing I do is pin at my registration marks. So those are the folded and pressed marks that we've done already on the clamshells. So I'm just going to put a pin through each of my registration marks first, and then we'll come back in and fill in the other pinning that we have to do. And the other pin is at the seam lines and by the tips of the clamshells as well. Whoop, had a little string there. So this is proof positive that Latifah does pin. If you've ever wondered, was there a situation where I did? I'm not a anti-pinner, which I jokingly say sometimes, but I'm a pin when necessary kind of girl. Okay, so that's at registration marks. And then we're going to come back in and pin at all of the other places. So right here on the tip, we're going to overlap that by just 1/4 of an inch because it's already folded back like that. So 1/4 of an inch is perfect. We're going to pin there. Then we're going to nestle our seams wherever the seams match up. And if we did our pressing properly, like the pattern calls for, then seam nestling should happen painlessly and easily. Just like that. And then this is the other place. Now, I'm going to try to open it up so you can see it. But this is where the tips, there we go, just like that. You can see the two tips. Then we're going to overlap that by about 1/2 of an inch. And we're going to pin. If for whatever reason you kind of get confused on that, a lot of times I'm just holding the two registration marks where we know where those are lined up and finding that center mark. But we know that overlaps about 1/2 of an inch. Another nestled seam here. It nestles really nicely because we pressed well according to the pattern directions. Just like that. And then we're going to come to the end and just line those ends up, and we're going to pin that as well. So when you finish pinning, you're going to have this really weird sort of a wavy, doesn't kind of lay straight section that you've pinned. And those rows are going to start to get longer, especially across kind of the middle diagonal of the quilt. So as far as machine settings go, this is one thing I want you to be really careful about, is I want you to sew a generous 1/4 inch seam. And that's not something we hear often. We hear scant all the time or an exact 1/4 inch. So if your machine has the ability to do small movements, then like on my Janome, 1/4 inch factory setting is 8.3. Sometime I push it to 8.7. Sometime for scant, I'm all the way at a 9. On this, I'm at an 8.0. The reason being is where those tips overlap is our scant 1/4 inch, and we want to make sure we're capturing those ends in the seam. So a generous 1/4 inch seam allows us to do this. So now I have my machine set. Standard stitch length it's fine. It's totally appropriate for this quilt. So now we're just going to sew. And as we sew these curves, we're going to take our time. We're going to use the benefits of the pinless piecing technique. But just remember, you'll have your curves are changing direction. So the longer seam will be on the top or the bottom, and it'll change at every every half of a clamshell. So we're just going to sew a few stitches, stop with that needle in the down position. Once again, set your machine up so the needle stops in the down position, or get into the habit, if your machine does not have that automatic setting, get into the habit of every time you stop sewing, you turn the needle so that you turn the wheel so that your needle goes down. So now I'm just taking my time with this. This is definitely not a pedal to the metal, super speedy process. We just want to take our time so that once we're finished this long seam, and of course the seams get longer, then we have a nice, smooth, flat curve. And that our seams nestle and everything lines up really nice and pretty. So take your time with it. So I'm just making sure it's really flat right in front of the needle. I have those edges aligned. That's my first registration mark. And then if you need to, you stop and adjust. If you get bulk in front of your needle, this is still curved piecing. So we're using those same sort of techniques. Sew to your first registration mark and stop. Then we're going to adjust. So I'm actually lifting my presser foot up using my knee lift. If you don't have a knee lift, you want to reach behind and lift it up here. And you want to get everything nice and flat. Pay attention to the fabric on top as well as to the fabric on the bottom to make sure it's nice and flat. And a lot of times you can feel it through the top layer just to make sure it's nice and flat. Sewing those rows together. Get bulk in front of your needle, you're pulling that to the back. You still want your edges nice and aligned though, so make sure they're nice and aligned. Bulk in front of the needle, you're pulling that fabric to the back from the left-hand side. So that's our first seam. We want it to be nice and nestled, so we carefully take that pin out and we're adjusting again. We're making sure the fabric on the bottom is nice and flat. The fabric on the top is nice and flat. We're making sure our edges are aligned, properly aligned. Now this is one of those curves because it changes directions, especially on your smaller curves like your 8-inch clammy or your 6-inch clammy, that would be difficult to glue based, just because gluing and pressing and getting with the curves changing direction and everything. So this is really probably the best technique for putting this together. We are at the next registration mark. We are adjusting. Make sure the fabric underneath is nice and flat. The fabric on top is nice and flat. And then we align those edges. Just like that. Now you can tell when it's nice and smooth, you can sew it together. Now remember, I think we're coming to, yeah, I can see it through the back. We're coming to that section where those two tips from clamshells are joining. So that generous 1/4 inch seam should capture them nicely. And once we finish sewing this, then we'll actually take it off the machine and double check, since this is one of our first seams, just to make sure that our settings are proper. And I can see that my needle was just to the left of those seams, so I think it's going to be perfect. So I'm adjusting the fabric on top, making sure it's nice and smooth on the bottom. I can feel it through here. It feels nice and smooth, and we're adjusting those edges. So yeah, take your time with this one. In some ways, sewing those rows together is quick because you're just sewing those half clamshells. But when you get to this point, you do want to slow down, and you'll definitely tell the result at the end of your project when you see how smooth those curves are. Make sure it's nice and smooth. We're getting a little bulk in front of our needle, so we're pulling that fabric to the back. It just gets the bulk out from in front of the needle and makes it nice and smooth in front of it. All right, we're almost finished this row. Adjust those edges together, make sure it's nice and flat on top and underneath. Make sure the edges are aligned. We're about to come to this pin. Now, I wouldn't pin more heavily than this because then the pins will just get in the way and you still have to adjust. So I think this is about the heaviest I would ever pin on a project like this. And we're almost at the end. So once again, make sure it's nice and flat on the top and on the bottom. Let's just make sure. It's nice and flat, just like that. And we're going to sew straight to the end, taking that pin out. Now let's cut our thread and let's take a look at that seam. Oh, we can see it already. It is nice and smooth. So that's sewing your rows together with the Clam Toss quilt. I hope that was helpful. Remember, nothing is difficult if you take it one stitch at a time.